In the pursuit of love, men often embark on a journey that is both deeply personal and profoundly transformative. The path of love, at least the love that we may call true, is not something that can be easily defined, nor is it a straight line. It is, in a sense, an adventure, one that demands courage, integrity, and sacrifice. But what exactly does a man do when he truly loves? What actions and attitudes define him as someone who is in the presence of love, someone who seeks to embody the highest ideals of love in its deepest, most meaningful form? And so there is no possibility of purpose without Jesus, and men were lost without confession, without prayer, without faith, without gentleness. The first thing a man does is confront his own weaknesses, his own limitations. Love, in its truest sense, is not merely a romantic fantasy. It is an encounter with something deeper than oneself. Love challenges us. It forces us to face those parts of ourselves we would rather ignore, our fears, our insecurities, our desires that lead us astray. In this confrontation, the man must reckon with the darkest parts of his psyche. He must grapple with his own imperfections, because love does not simply seek to comfort, nor does it turn a blind eye to the harsh truths of the human condition. True love demands that we become better versions of ourselves. And this begins with understanding that we are not perfect. For a man to love in the truest sense, he must understand the depth of responsibility that comes with it. Responsibility is not an abstract concept, it is concrete and tangible. The love of a man requires him to be steadfast in his commitment, not just in moments of passion, but in the everyday, mundane moments where consistency is crucial. It demands that he show up even when the initial excitement fades, and that he continues to put forth effort into the relationship when things become difficult. A man who loves does not avoid responsibility, but rather he embraces it fully. He knows that love is not just about taking, it is equally about giving, about being present in the most meaningful way possible. The second thing a man does for love is to set aside his own ego. In a world that often prioritizes the individual, the ego becomes an obstacle to true love. When the man is deeply committed, he begins to recognize that the relationship is greater than the sum of his own desires, his need for admiration, for validation, and even for control. These things diminish in the face of something more profound. And why would we expect our partners to ascribe our needs to all things that add to their own self-realization and all things that add to their own self? True love requires humility. It requires a man to understand that in the space of love, he is not the center of attention, but rather a part of something larger, something transcendent. It demands that the man listen more than he speaks, that he value the voice of another, and that he learns to subjugate his own pride in favor of mutual respect. The third thing a man does is to protect, not just physically, but emotionally and spiritually. Protection, in the realm of love, is not simply a matter of ensuring safety from external threats. It goes much deeper. A man who truly loves will seek to safeguard the emotional well-being of his partner, creating a space where trust and vulnerability can flourish. He becomes a guardian of her peace, her heart, and her sense of self-worth. Protection also extends to the spiritual realm, where love challenges a man to defend the values that nurture and sustain the relationship. It is a complex and layered responsibility, and it is not without its demands. But a man who loves understands that he is entrusted with something precious, and he acts accordingly. The fourth thing a man does for love is to seek growth, not only for himself, but also for the relationship. Love, in its truest sense, is a dynamic force. It is not static, and it does not remain unchanged. A man who loves is constantly seeking to grow, to evolve, and to transform. This growth manifests in many ways. intellectually, emotionally, and even physically. It is a pursuit of greater understanding, a constant effort to improve as a person and to contribute to the mutual growth of the relationship. This pursuit of growth requires effort, patience, and the willingness to face challenges head-on. A man who loves does not stagnate. He moves forward, always striving to become a better version of himself. But more than that, he also helps to foster that growth in the relationship itself. He creates an environment where both partners can flourish, where the potential for greatness is nurtured, and where the bond between them becomes stronger over time. The fifth thing a man does is to choose sacrifice. This is perhaps the most difficult of all, for it requires a man to give up something of himself. Sacrifice does not mean abandoning one's identity, but it does mean making difficult choices for the sake of the greater good. Love often demands that a man put the needs of another before his own, that he makes choices that are not always comfortable, and that he willingly give up his own convenience for the sake of the relationship. In a world where instant gratification is often the norm, sacrifice can seem foreign and even counterintuitive. But true love is not about seeking only one's own happiness. It is about the happiness and well-being of both individuals involved. Sacrifice, in this context, is an act of love, a willingness to give up something in the present for something far more valuable in the future. These 5 actions, the confrontation with one's weaknesses, the embracing of responsibility, the setting aside of ego, the commitment to growth, and the willingness to sacrifice, are not easy. They require strength, integrity, and the capacity for deep introspection. But they are the hallmarks of a man who has truly chosen love, not just as a fleeting emotion or a temporary feeling, but as a profound and enduring force. In a world that is often consumed with self-interest, these actions stand as a testament to the power of love in its purest form. True love is not a passive experience. It is an active, transformative force that demands the best of us, that pushes us to grow, and that leads us to something greater than ourselves. True love challenges a man to face his own flaws and weaknesses while taking on the responsibility of being committed and reliable. It requires constant effort, not just in moments of excitement, but throughout the everyday struggles of life. In love, a man must prioritize humility and mutual respect, moving beyond his own ego. He must listen, learn, and recognize that the relationship is greater than his individual desires or needs. A man who truly loves seeks personal growth and fosters the growth of the relationship. This requires sacrifice, putting the needs of the relationship and the other person before one's own, ultimately choosing long-term well-being over short-term convenience. In the journey of love, the notion of confronting weakness is an essential, though difficult, step in a man's development. Love, when approached with seriousness and depth, does not leave us unchanged. It exposes the very nature of who we are, not just in our moments of triumph, but also in our moments of failure and vulnerability. A man who is capable of confronting his own weaknesses is someone who has the courage to face what might otherwise remain hidden, those parts of himself that he might prefer to ignore or even deny. In fact, this is where true strength begins. It is only through confronting the darker aspects of our nature that we can begin to heal and transform. Love asks this of a man: to not only understand his weaknesses, but to act with courage and responsibility in their presence. One of the foundational elements of confronting weakness in love is the recognition that we are all imperfect. This is not a philosophical ideal, but a concrete reality that each person must face. The idealized versions of ourselves, the image we may present to the world, are often constructed to hide the parts of us we deem unworthy or weak. But love, in its truest form, calls us to be honest, both with ourselves and with those we love. There is no room for pretense in genuine intimacy. A man who loves with sincerity will encounter moments where he must acknowledge the things he would rather not admit. his fear of failure, his lack of confidence, his past mistakes, and perhaps his deepest insecurities. It is in these moments, when confronted with his weaknesses, that the man begins to change, not through avoidance, but through acceptance and courage. This confrontation is not something that happens in a single moment of clarity. It is a continual process. The first step is recognizing the nature of our weaknesses. For many men, this may take the form of pride. Pride can be a barrier to personal growth and understanding, as it shields us from facing our vulnerabilities. A man's ego, when unchecked, can blind him to the areas in which he needs to grow. It can tell him that he is beyond reproach, that he has nothing to improve upon, and that he is not the problem in any given situation. This can be particularly damaging in relationships, where vulnerability is key to fostering trust and intimacy. To truly love and be loved, a man must shed this ego and learn to acknowledge his shortcomings without shame. He's recognizing pride, as well as the many other weaknesses we might have. Fear, doubt, impatience, selfishness is the first step in becoming someone who is capable of sustaining a meaningful relationship. The next step in confronting one's weaknesses is learning to take responsibility. Responsibility is not a concept that many are comfortable with. It is often seen as a burden or something that restricts freedom. In the modern world, where individualism is prized, responsibility is sometimes perceived as a limitation rather than a path to personal growth. But in the context of love, responsibility is essential. A man who is serious about love must take responsibility not just for his actions, but also for his feelings, thoughts, and even the unspoken dynamics within a relationship. Taking responsibility means being accountable for the energy we bring into a relationship, the way we communicate, and the way we handle our emotions. Responsibility also requires a man to show up, day after day, in both big and small ways. It is easy to be present when things are easy, when emotions are high, and when there are no real challenges to face. However, true responsibility is demonstrated in the quiet, unremarkable moments of life. It is in the mundane, the everyday routine of maintaining a relationship that the real work happens. A man who truly loves does not disappear when things get tough. A man who truly loves does not disappear when things get tough. He does not run from conflict, and he does not shy away from being held accountable. Instead, he engages with his partner, communicates openly, and seeks solutions together. The act of showing up, despite feeling afraid or unsure, is a powerful form of responsibility. Responsibility also extends beyond just one's own actions. It is about taking ownership of the relationship as a whole. When problems arise, when tensions build, or when misunderstandings occur, the man who is capable of true love does not place blame on his partner or external circumstances. Instead, he takes a step back and asks, "What can I do to make this better? How can I make it so they trust me again?" It requires the maturity to understand that in a committed relationship, both partners play a role in both the successes and the failures that occur. This kind of responsibility requires emotional maturity and the willingness to not always have things go as expected or desired. It means that the man does not see his relationship as something that can be taken for granted, but as something that must be nurtured with care, attention, and deliberate effort. Responsibility, then, is not a burden, but an expression of commitment, a demonstration of a deep, abiding love that is not contingent upon external circumstances, but is anchored in the person's resolve to build something meaningful. The idea of confronting one's weaknesses is not, however, limited to personal introspection and responsibility within a relationship. It also involves learning how to manage one's emotions and impulses, especially in times of stress. It is easy to allow emotions to dictate one's actions when things are difficult. Anger, frustration, and fear can quickly overtake reason and empathy. In these moments, a man must be able to stand firm against these emotions, recognizing them but choosing not to be ruled by them. A man who loves must develop the ability to control his impulses and respond thoughtfully rather than react impulsively. This requires a great deal of emotional intelligence, the awareness of what one is feeling and why, and the discipline to act in alignment with one's values rather than one's emotional impulses. This is particularly challenging when the weaknesses a man faces are tied to past experiences or wounds. Unresolved trauma or past hurt can often manifest in unhealthy patterns in relationships. The man who loves must be willing to confront these past experiences, not as a way of blaming others or remaining stuck in victimhood, but as a way of freeing himself from the chains of the past. It means that he must heal, grow, and break free from patterns of behavior that do not serve him or the relationship. Healing from past wounds requires vulnerability, humility, and a willingness to face painful memories or emotions. But in doing so, the man becomes capable of offering love without the distortions of past pain. His capacity to give love expands as he confronts what holds him back. This is the paradox of love. To be able to truly love another, a man must first learn how to love himself, which includes confronting and overcoming the weaknesses that have held him back. And footnote. Another aspect of embracing responsibility in the context of confronting weaknesses is the willingness to learn from others. True strength in love is not about knowing all the answers or being the one who always has the right solution. Instead, it is about humility and openness to growth. This often comes through learning from others, especially those who may see things from a different perspective. A man who loves does not isolate himself or live in a bubble of self-affirmation. Instead, he seeks out feedback, learns from the experiences of others, and is willing to be challenged. Growth in this sense requires an openness to critique, to questioning, and to the continual process of learning. A man who loves is always striving to be better, to grow, and to refine himself in every aspect of his life, intellectually, emotionally, and spiritually. Ultimately, confronting one's weaknesses and embracing responsibility is a transformative process. It requires a shift in how we view ourselves and the world around us. Love forces us to look in the mirror, to see the things we often try to hide, and to take responsibility for the way we show up in the world. It is not about perfection, but about progress. A man who loves deeply understands that love is not a destination, but a journey, a continuous unfolding of who we are and who we are becoming. It is in the confrontation of our weaknesses that we find the strength to love more fully, more selflessly, and more authentically. The act of confronting weakness, coupled with the embracing of responsibility, is the foundation upon which true love is built. It is through this process that a man becomes not just a better partner, but a more complete person, someone capable of offering love in its most profound and transformative form. And that means embracing both the pulses of love and misfortune, which are part of the human condition. In the pursuit of genuine transformative love, one of the most profound shifts a man must undergo is the setting aside of his ego. This is no small task, for the ego in all its forms is an integral part of the human experience. It is the construct we build around ourselves to navigate the world, to assert our identity, and to protect us from the vulnerability of being fully seen and known by others. But while the ego serves a function, it is also the greatest obstacle to true connection. Love in its purest form calls a man to surrender this ego, not to abandon it entirely, but to diminish its grip on how he engages with others, especially those with whom he shares an intimate bond. In this surrender lies the potential for mutual respect, a respect that transcends the self and creates space for the flourishing of a relationship based on trust, humility, and shared growth. The ego often manifests itself as pride, the need to feel superior or more significant than others. It is the force within us that craves validation, recognition, and control. It feeds off external praise and flinches when faced with criticism. At its core, the ego is tied to a deep-seated fear of inadequacy or rejection, And in relationships, this can create a dynamic of imbalance. A man who is consumed by his ego may enter a relationship with the desire to dominate or prove his worthiness, rather than seeking genuine connection and mutual growth. In such a state, he is less capable of seeing the other person as an equal, and more likely to view them through the lens of how they serve or enhance his own identity. However, love requires something far more profound than the validation of one's own sense of self. Love, when truly felt and expressed, demands that a man recognize the inherent worth and dignity of the other person. To set aside the ego means to see the other as fully human, as a person with their own needs, desires, and vulnerabilities. It is only through this recognition that true connection can be formed. Mutual respect, then, is the bedrock upon which love can be built. But respect is not something that can be easily demanded or assumed. It must be cultivated through action, through the daily practice of putting aside one's own desires in favor of understanding, valuing, and supporting the other person. The process of setting aside the ego begins with self-awareness. A man must first acknowledge the presence of his ego and how it influences his actions, thoughts, and behaviors. This is not an easy process, as the ego tends to conceal itself under the guise of righteousness or self-assurance. Often it masquerades as self-confidence or a deep sense of purpose. But beneath the surface, the ego is driven by insecurity, a need to protect itself from perceived threats. A man who is deeply invested in his own ego will find it difficult to hear criticism, to admit when he is wrong, or to be vulnerable in a relationship. These are the very qualities that inhibit true intimacy and connection. True self-awareness requires the courage to see oneself honestly. It means being willing to confront the parts of oneself that are driven by fear, pride, and defensiveness. When a man is able to step back and observe how his ego functions in relationships, he can begin to see where it sabotages meaningful connection. Perhaps he becomes defensive when his partner expresses a need. Or maybe he struggles to listen because he is preoccupied with proving his own viewpoint. These are moments when the ego is operating unchecked, blocking the possibility for true communication and mutual understanding. Self-awareness is the first step in creating space for the ego to take a back seat, allowing the relationship to flourish in its place. Once a man becomes aware of how his ego operates, the next step is to actively choose to set it aside in moments of conflict or disagreement. This requires a conscious effort, for the ego's tendency is to protect itself, to assert its dominance, and to ensure its position of superiority. But love does not thrive in an environment where one person is constantly seeking to win, to be right, or to dominate the conversation. Mutual respect is founded upon a willingness to listen and to understand the other person's perspective, even when it challenges one's own beliefs or feelings. The act of listening, when free from the interference of the ego, is a powerful tool for fostering respect in a relationship. It is through listening that we come to truly know another person, to understand not only what they say, but also what they feel, fear, and hope for. The ego often prevents us from listening fully, as it is focused on forming a rebuttal or proving its own point. In contrast, when a man is willing to put his ego aside, he opens himself to the possibility of genuine understanding. He listens not just to respond, but to absorb and empathize with the other person's experience. This kind of listening requires humility. It requires the man to admit that he does not know everything, that his perspective is limited, and that there is always room to learn from the other. It is in this humble listening that true respect is built. Furthermore, setting aside the ego involves letting go of the need to control. The ego thrives on control, whether it is controlling outcomes, situations, or the behavior of others. A man who operates from a place of ego will often try to shape the world around him to fit his own needs and desires. In relationships, this manifests as a desire to manipulate, to demand, or to expect things to go according to his plan. But love in its most authentic form is not about control. It is about mutual freedom and growth. True love is not a relationship where one person dictates the terms or exerts dominance over the other. It is a partnership built on shared goals, mutual respect, and the willingness to navigate challenges together. Letting go of control does not mean being passive or indifferent, but it does mean relinquishing the need to dominate or manipulate the outcome of every situation. It means trusting that the relationship can survive and even thrive without micromanagement. In this space of freedom, both individuals are allowed to express themselves fully, to make mistakes, and to learn from those mistakes without fear of judgment or retribution. A man who is able to set aside his ego and relinquish control is able to create an environment in which both partners can flourish, in which respect is mutual and love is allowed to grow. Another important aspect of setting aside the ego for mutual respect is the willingness to admit when one is wrong. The ego, as it functions in its most defensive form, rarely allows for mistakes. It seeks perfection, it avoids vulnerability, and it resists any admission of weakness. But in relationships, mistakes are inevitable. No one is perfect, and every relationship requires the willingness to apologize, to own up to one's errors, and to seek forgiveness. A man who is unable to admit when he is wrong is trapped in his ego, unable to truly connect with his partner on an emotional level. He may dismiss his partner's feelings or invalidate their experiences, all in an attempt to preserve his own sense of superiority. To truly respect another person is to acknowledge their pain, their feelings, and their point of view, even when it contradicts our own. It is about seeing the other as a fully autonomous, valid person whose emotions and experiences matter just as much as our own. This can be particularly challenging when pride or shame makes it difficult to admit fault. But when a man is able to humbly apologize and take responsibility for his actions, he demonstrates the depth of his respect for the other person. It is not a sign of weakness, but of strength. Strength rooted in vulnerability, humility, and emotional maturity. The act of setting aside the ego also has a direct impact on the way a man communicates. Relationships are not built on fleeting moments of passion or superficial gestures. They are sustained by the ongoing work of mutual respect, understanding, and compromise. The ego, in its desire to be always right, to dominate, or to protect itself, cannot sustain love over time. It is too fragile, too focused on self-preservation to build something enduring. But love that is rooted in mutual respect has the capacity to weather the inevitable storms that come in every relationship. It is grounded in the understanding that both individuals are equals, that both have value, and that both are deserving of respect. In this way, love becomes a partnership, one in which both individuals are allowed to grow, to learn, and to evolve. It is a dynamic, ever-changing experience, but one that is rooted in the recognition that both partners are worthy of dignity and care. The ego, in its most destructive form, seeks to undermine this dynamic by elevating one person above the other. But when a man is able to set aside his ego, he enters a relationship where both partners can shine, where both can be seen and valued for who they truly are, and where respect forms the foundation of everything they do. The first in the last is the second in the first. This is the power of love. When two people, free from the grip of ego, come together in a shared commitment to mutual respect, growth, and connection. In the absence of ego, love becomes the greatest force for transformation, both within the individual and within the relationship itself. In the realm of love, growth and sacrifice are not abstract concepts. They are living, breathing forces that shape the trajectory of a relationship. The interplay between these two elements is profound, as both are necessary for the development of a truly meaningful connection. Growth is not simply about becoming a better individual in a vacuum. It is about evolving within the context of a relationship, pushing oneself beyond previous limitations, and striving to create something greater than what either person could accomplish alone. Sacrifice, on the other hand, is the act of giving up something of value, be it time, energy, comfort, or even personal aspirations, for the greater good of the relationship. It is a choice to prioritize the needs, dreams, and well-being of the other person, often at the expense of one's own desires. These two forces, when combined, forge a bond that transcends the superficial aspects of love and roots it in something far deeper, a shared commitment to mutual growth and the well-being of both individuals. For growth to occur in the context of love, both partners must be willing to challenge themselves. This does not mean that growth is easy or without discomfort. In fact, true growth often occurs only in the face of discomfort, when individuals are pushed out of their comfort zones and forced to confront aspects of themselves that they might prefer to leave untouched. In a relationship, this often manifests as confronting one's own weaknesses, insecurities, fears, emotional barriers that can prevent genuine connection. A man who is in love understands that in order to create a healthy, thriving partnership, he must first work on himself. This means taking responsibility for his actions, acknowledging where he falls short, and continually striving to improve. However, growth in love is not solely about individual development. It is equally about the relationship itself, which must be nurtured and allowed to evolve. Relationships, like individuals, go through phases. There are times of intense connection and periods of struggle. There are moments of mutual understanding, and there are moments when miscommunication leads to tension. A relationship, if it is to be sustainable, must grow through these phases. It must be flexible, adapting to new circumstances, evolving in response to changes in both individuals and external conditions. For a man who loves truly, this means committing to the continuous development of the relationship, investing the time and energy necessary to foster growth in both himself and his partner. It means recognizing that a relationship is not a static entity, but a dynamic process that requires effort, attention, and adaptability. So, this growth often requires a willingness to embrace vulnerability. Vulnerability is the antithesis of the ego. It asks a man to expose his fears, his insecurities, and his true self to another person. This is not an easy thing to do, especially in a world that prizes strength and invulnerability. However, in the context of love, vulnerability is not a weakness. It is a source of strength. It is through vulnerability that deeper connections are forged, as it allows both individuals to see one another fully and to experience each other's humanity. Growth within the context of love requires that both partners create a safe space in which they can share their fears and dreams, their weaknesses and strengths, without judgment. This kind of openness fosters an environment where both partners are free to evolve, to grow, and to become better versions of themselves within the relationship. But growth, while essential, is not enough on its own. It must be accompanied by sacrifice. Sacrifice is the natural companion of love because love, in its truest form, requires us to give up something of ourselves for the greater good. It asks us to set aside our own desires, comforts, and ambitions for the sake of another person. Sacrifice does not mean self-neglect or losing oneself in the process. Rather, it means choosing to put the needs of the relationship and the other person above immediate self-interest. This act of giving is not always easy. It can be painful, especially when it involves making difficult decisions or letting go of something that is personally significant. Sacrifice is often misunderstood in modern culture, which emphasizes individualism and personal fulfillment. Many believe that love should be easy, that it should be about mutual pleasure and satisfaction without any real cost. However, the reality of love is far more complex. True love is not about the pursuit of personal happiness at the expense of another. It is about working together to build something larger than oneself. This often requires sacrifice. For a man who is committed to love, sacrifice might mean putting aside his own personal ambitions for the sake of his partner's dreams. It could involve making difficult choices, such as prioritizing time with family over career advancement, or foregoing personal comforts to support a partner through a challenging period. Sacrifice in its purest form is a reflection of the depth of one's commitment to another person. It demonstrates that the relationship is valued above individual desires, that the happiness and well-being of the other person are prioritized. The act of sacrifice in love is not always grand or dramatic. It can be found in the small, everyday actions that demonstrate care and commitment. It is in the willingness to compromise, to make room for the other person's needs and desires, even when it requires personal discomfort. It might involve giving up a Saturday afternoon to help with a partner's project, or choosing to stay home instead of going out with friends to offer emotional support during a difficult time. Sacrifice can also be seen in the willingness to let go of old habits or patterns that are not conducive to the relationship. For instance, a man who loves might choose to address his emotional issues rather than avoiding them, knowing that his growth will benefit both him and his partner. These sacrifices are not necessarily easy, but they are vital to the strength and longevity of a relationship. What makes sacrifice in love truly transformative is its reciprocal nature. The act of giving up something for another person does not diminish the giver. Rather, it enriches both individuals. Love is not a one-sided transaction where one person constantly gives and the other takes. True love is a partnership in which both individuals are equally invested in each other's well-being. Sacrifice, when both partners are willing to make it, leads to a deeper sense of connection and fulfillment. Each sacrifice strengthens the relationship and reinforces the sense of shared purpose and commitment. Sacrifices include recognizing rules and decrees of which manner of declaring an exclusion of the couple. Sacrifice also plays a crucial role in the process of conflict resolution within relationships. In any long-term partnership, disagreements and challenges will inevitably arise. During these times, the ability to sacrifice one's own pride, need to be right, or desire for control can be the key to resolving conflict. Sacrifice in these moments means choosing reconciliation over being vindicated, choosing understanding over being heard, and choosing connection over being proven correct. It means letting go of the desire to dominate the situation and instead seeking a solution that benefits both individuals. Conflict is an inevitable part of any relationship, but how it is handled can either strengthen or weaken the bond. A relationship that is grounded in mutual sacrifice and growth is far more resilient in the face of conflict, as both partners are committed to working together for the greater good of the relationship. Further, the act of sacrifice also extends to the emotional realm. Love often requires us to face uncomfortable emotions, fear, jealousy, sadness, or even guilt. These emotions can create internal tension, and in these moments, a man might feel the urge to protect himself by withdrawing, by shutting down, or by defending his own emotional state. However, love asks for the courage to sacrifice these emotional barriers for the sake of intimacy. This means being vulnerable in the face of fear, opening up even when it feels uncomfortable, and expressing one's emotions honestly and openly. It means choosing connection over self-protection. This level of emotional sacrifice deepens the trust between partners and creates an environment where both individuals feel safe to be their authentic selves. In this space, both partners are able to grow emotionally, learning not only about each other but about themselves as well. When both partners are engaged in the continuous cycle of growth and sacrifice, the relationship itself becomes a vehicle for mutual transformation. It is no longer a static, comfortable space, but a dynamic, evolving partnership that challenges both individuals to be better, to push past their limitations, and to strive for the common good. This kind of relationship is deeply fulfilling, as it is rooted in a shared vision for the future, one where both individuals are constantly evolving, growing, and sacrificing for the benefit of each other and the partnership as a whole. In this sense, love becomes a journey, one in which both partners are actively engaged in shaping a future together, one that is far greater than the sum of their individual aspirations. The relationship becomes a space where both individuals are free to pursue their personal growth, but also held accountable for the impact they have on the other person. It is a space where sacrifice is not seen as a burden but as a gift, an opportunity to show the depth of one's commitment. The act of giving, of prioritizing the other person's needs and well-being, creates an unbreakable bond, one that is built not just on feelings, but on the tangible, everyday actions of care, empathy, and respect. Ultimately, growth and sacrifice for the greater good are not mutually exclusive. They are two sides of the same coin. It is through growth that we are able to offer more to our partner and to the relationship, and it is through sacrifice that we demonstrate our commitment to the relationship's success. Both are necessary, and both are transformative. In this process, love ceases to be an abstract ideal and becomes a lived reality, one that shapes both individuals and the relationship itself. The growth that comes from this sacrifice leads to a love that is deeper, more resilient, and more profound than anything either partner could achieve alone.